Okay, so I'm going to be presenting on Cindy Sherman, and she is an American photographer, and she is known in particular for her self-portraits that point to the fact of social roles and stereotypes. And so she is part of what is called the picture generation. And so that is actually a circle of American artists who were recognized during the early 1980s. And so that was a period of time that was notable for rapid growth of mass media images. And so her works show that no one was born with a sense of identity, but rather we find our identity from pieces of popular culture. And so Cindy Sherman was born on January 19th, 1954, and she's actually still alive today. And so she was born in Glenridge, New Jersey, and then shortly after her birth, her family moved to Huntington, where she grew up, and she was then the youngest of 5 children. And her parents actually didn't show very much interest in art, as her father was an engineer and her mother was a reading teacher. And so, after graduating from high school, Cindy Sherman enrolled at the State University of New York, and she majored in painting, but she soon changed to photography, as she found herself super upset with the limitations that paint had on her, and she also felt like she had nothing else she could say. So she actually ended up giving that up, and so she also stated that she felt there was nothing more for her to say through painting. So as I said before, she changed to photography. The only conflict, though, is that she failed a required photography class. But the solution to that was that she actually decided to retake the class, and that actually ended up fueling her passion for the subject even farther. And so while she was studying, she met a very pivotal person, and that was Robert Longo. And so together with Longo and then another fellow student, Charles Clow, she actually ended up forming Hall Walls, which was an independent artist space where she and other fellow artists exhibited their artwork. So I thought that was something super, super interesting. And so you can actually see a picture of the university down there below. And so after graduating in 1976, she decided to move to New York, and she decided to embark upon her artistic career. And so she began taking photos of herself actually in her loft in New York City, and those photos became known as the Untitled Film Series. So that is what we're going to talk about next here. So the Untitled Film Series, like I said, was began being created in 1976 after her graduation, and so it embodied the character of every woman, which we'll talk about later, and what that every woman kind of means. And so she recreated herself over and over again into different female roles that had been stereotyped. And so just a couple of those that I'll be covering are the housewife, the prostitute, and the noblewoman in need of help. And so I actually found this quote about the series, and I'll have that cited later, but the series was about the fakeness of role-playing, as well as contempt for the demeanoring male audience who would mistakenly read the images as sexy. And we'll kind of talk about that a little bit later, as we'll talk specifically about those images and how they were perceived. And so Sherman would wear wigs and costumes that would evoke images from the realms of advertising, television, film, and fashion. And so those things challenged the cultural stereotypes that were supported by media. So it took her 3 years, and the outcome of all of this was that it secured her position in New York art. So the first untitled film that we'll talk about is the untitled film Still Number 13. And so in the 1970s, it was actually the rise of feminism, and so that caused Sherman and her generation to really look into those media cliches and then ultimately lay them to rest. And so this film still is staged to look like a scene from a 1950s and 60s Hollywood film, which I thought is super cool. And so by staging herself as the main character, she kind of portrays herself as an example of a common stereotype of women. And so in this picture in particular, she plays the stereotypical role of a woman on the verge of finding her true womanhood, or she's also portrayed as kind of the classic virgin. And so that is what is portrayed in here. And I think I forgot to mention this before, but there's actually over 70 black and white photographs in these Untitled film series. So I obviously don't have enough time to go through all of those, but we'll look at a couple examples here along with some of her other works. So in this next work then, it's Untitled Film Still number 21. And so it's staged to look like an opening scene actually from a long since canceled television show, which I thought is super interesting. And so in this role, Sherman plays the role of a small town girl who happens to come upon the big city. And so she's at first unsure of the lights and the shadows, but she's soon pulled in by all of its attractions. So there you can see a picture of Sherman, and obviously you can see the background there too. So then next here, one of her other, her first job actually was Artforum magazine, and so she was asked to do the centerfold for an upcoming issue in a very, very popular magazine, which is called Artforum magazine, and so this took place in 1981, and so a centerfold essentially is 2 pages of a magazine for an upcoming issue, and so she decided to take some pictures, and so she placed the camera above herself, and so she's crouched on the ground or made to look like she was almost in a trance. And so ultimately in the end, her pictures were rejected by her editor, as she believed that the photographs might be misunderstood and were also a little too risky. So then that leads into our next Untitled film still, and that is number 92. So it's still unsure to this day if this picture is in response to her rejection, but it's marked as one of her darker attempts than most of her previous work. And so if you looked at these photos, you can see they contained a lot of gloomy colors and scenes with vomit and mold, and this ultimately challenged viewers to find beauty in the ugly. And so kind of like I just stated here, she really went on to change her style, and that's where this picture really comes in. And so for the first time, Sherman was not the model in all of her images, and so she would shoot from 1985 until 1989 actually, and so she often initially dressed to look scary, and she set herself in strange and odd places with odd colors, so colors like blue and green and red. And so at the time she would use things like doll parts or prosthetic body parts to substitute her own, and so she would crouch on the ground and she would fearfully look away from the camera, and so she also had like the wet hair look and then the tense position as well. So she honestly looks like she had just walked off the set of a horror film. And so also judging by her clothes, so you can see like with the white shirt, the plaid skirt, it kind of looks like a private school girl. And so judging by her clothes, we can also take a guess that she was pointed to about some stereotypes of private school girls and also their vulnerability at the time. And so that led into the history portraits, and so that was a series following the disasters and fairy tales. And so it kind of took on the subjects of art images, and so this is one of her second most known bodies of work, and it came a while after the film stills had already been well received, and so that was around like 1988 to 1990, and so these images presented Sherman as a model, but this time she assumed the role of many European art history's most famous leading women. And so at the time she actually lived in Europe and drew her inspiration from the West's greatest museums. And so the history portraits ultimately led to the sex pictures. And so the sex pictures were in response to the editing of art of artists Robert and Andre. And so it features dolls arranged in compromising positions. And so in 1992, this was the first time that she was entirely absent from all of her photographs. So instead, to shock the public, she used dolls in prosthetic body parts, which are posed in highly sexual positions. So these images are set clearly apart from pornography, but they clearly point to the dehumanization of women. And so once again here you can just see how she draws out these certain things where they would often be hidden, but then she associates them with things that people so much desire. So it's super, super, super interesting to look at and read about. And so then that leads us to some of her more recent work. And so this is the Untitled 2004. And so here Sherman poses as a sad or pathetic clown. And so she wears makeup, costumes, and she even puts herself in front of digital backgrounds. And so she explores the characters of these clowns. And so sometimes it's intense, sometimes it's even about their humor, and other times it's about their sadness, and honestly sometimes about their anger and their rage. And so this image is set up like a glamour shot, and it focuses on the clown's face. And so that kind of challenges us as viewers to think about why we think that these clowns are so humorous, and really pulls us in and questions the clowns. And so this was one piece that I thought was super interesting, and it's one I'd honestly like to look more into and watch some videos about and get to know more about. And so then an Untitled 2008, this is an even more recent photo, and so that it explores the suburban American housewife, or the middle American everywoman, which we discussed earlier. And so an everywoman is a character who is sympathetic, often pathetic, and too close to recognize her comfort. And so this image kind of leaves interpretation open to us as viewers, and so it says more about the person looking at the image than the subject of the person who is portrayed. And so a little more about where she is today. So in 2006 she was honored by a retrospective of her work at a museum in Paris. And so that's the second image you see there. So there was the image, or the museum, where she was recognized. In 2008, she was stage female suburban in a solo show at Metro Pictures, New York. And then today she continues to live in New York City, where she is dating David, who is an American musician. And then finally, Cindy Sherman's legacy is that she's influenced the way that generations of artists think about photography, narratives, and identity. And she's also mastered many things such as makeup, prosthetics, digital technology, and inventing and portraying multiple identities which reflect our image-seeking culture. So I hope you guys learned a little bit about Cindy Sherman. Here is my works cited, and that is all I have today.